You want to,
Good morning. I'm glad you could take your time out on a Sunday to join us on one of our free webinar masterclass series where we invite eminent person from the industry, academia to share their thoughts and experiences. Before I introduce our guests who are attending new to our this webinar, so most welcome, and there are people who are regular to our webinar itself. So a small little introduction of ASQ. ASQ is a 75-year-old organization based out of Milwaukee. We're present in 130 countries and more through our networks, through our members, through our communities. That's how we serve. ASQ's mission, ASQ empowers people, community, and organization of the world to advance in excellence through quality. We have been present in India for more than 10 years, direct presence. We have been working with many of the industry leaders, academia, many of the organizations. We work very closely. One of them is, of course, the leadership what we get through Professor Prembarat. And ASQ is into membership, certification, training, project supports, and things like that. Many of the areas that we support related to quality and upstream and downstream of various kind of industry processes. Before I start, let me also introduce our eminent guest. In fact, Professor Prembarat requires no introduction, but if I start his introduction, probably, sir, I wouldn't be able to do the entire justice. A huge, so many years of achievement. I'll briefly touch on many of the things which is for the audience to please note. An outstanding academic, Professor Prembarat is the Pro-Chancellor, Professor of Eminence and Chief Mentor of NorthCap University, formerly known as ITM University, Gurgaon. Just prior to joining ITMU as Vice Chancellor in September 2011, he was Professor of Eminence at MDI, Gurgaon. Professor Prembarat was Founding Director of IIT Roorkee, Vice Chancellor of UP Technical University, Professor Head Center of Management Studies, Coordinated Applied System Research Program, Dean, Deputy Director and Director Officiating at IIT Delhi, Professor and Division Chairman of Asian Institute of Technology, Bangkok. He's Honorary Professor at IIT Delhi and Distinguished Adjunct Professor at IIT Bangkok. He was Chairman, Board of Governors of WIT Dehradun, and many other accolades that he already holds. And just to add a few points here, is that he has published more than 495 research papers, and which has got him citations of about 7,463. I think that's the number I'm hearing for the first time anybody I have called upon. Numerous accolades. If I talk about his won National System Gold Medal, Guru Award, Lifetime Achievement Award from various prestigious universities, institutions, national bodies. He has also been chairman of AICTE, NWRC, Chairman Program Implementation Committees of National Projects on Earthquake Engineering Education, and various other chairmen. I can actually go on. That's why I said I won't be able to do the entire justice to Professor Prembarat. That's right. So, without any further ado, let's just straight away get into our topic, which is on supply chain adapting to COVID-19 pandemic. We are all familiar to a situation like this, and for the last 3 months, I think both industry and people, we are all challenged with the current pandemic and what to do. And business has just opened up. How do we manage? There are a lot of challenges that an individual goes through this particular journey. An organization goes through in trying to plan. How do I manage a supply chain? What are the various challenges we're going to face? How we can support our downstream people? What we need to do in order to make the upstream also happen, and things like that. And this is where Professor Prembarat's expertise comes into play, and his thoughts and wisdom is what we look forward to hearing from him. Professor Prembarat, without further ado, it's over to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Mr. Sarakji, and friends, welcome to this webinar. The theme that adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, during this period, if you look at some of the terms being used in all the media after Corona, perhaps the next most talked about words used in the media are supply chain, because almost everyone is impacted by the destruction that has taken place in all the three components of supply chain: upstreams, midstreams, and downstream. Now, supply chain management, as you know, is the backbone of any nation's economy. So much so that the quality of supply chain management, the quality of service that supply chain management is able to give you, is sometimes taken as a surrogate measure of the development index of a nation. Indeed, there is a study to prove that about 70% R square, which is the quotient of explanation, says that 70% of the development index of a nation is impacted by the quality of the supply chain. And it's very obvious, because almost the supply chain in its totality requires for infrastructure, systems, processes, technology, people, inventory, and all that goes with it. And that's why it's extremely important for any nation to look at the supply chain management effectively. Even otherwise, before this pandemic, supply chain management was indeed a very popular topic, but it has become extremely critical due to the breakdown of almost all components of supply chain management during this process. As you know, supply chain management is basically managing the flow of materials, money, and information into, through, and out of the system. In fact, it's a very simple way of looking at it. Into takes care of the upstream, midstream is taken care of by through, and out of the system is the downstream. And therefore, upstreams, midstreams, and downstreams, all the three links, or you call it inward logistics, operations, and the outward logistics, and the other terms being used, almost all the three links of it have been impacted by the current COVID-19 pandemic. And obviously, it has put us into reassessing ourselves. Have we made some mistakes in the process of designing, or did we overlook some important resilience and risk-related issues in managing supply chain in the past? And as a result, as you know, any management methods and techniques are contingent upon the situation in which you are working. For quite some time, we were almost obsessed with what was known as just-in-time. Just-in-time management in the Japanese manufacturing systems, or zero inventory. Whereas, as you know, in Indian context, even otherwise, before this pandemic, the business environment of demand and supply was never just-in-time like. I've been calling that even pre-pandemic business environment in India a just-in-case environment, full of uncertainties, of the demand uncertainties, supply uncertainties, lead time uncertainties, quality uncertainties, inflationary pressure, price uncertainties, and so on. So even otherwise, supply chain management in the Indian context before this pandemic was a just-in-case environment, which became still more difficult when we turned to globalization. As you know, almost every country, in the interest of saving cost, almost resorted to extensive outsourcing of many of their manufacturing operations, primarily to China. Almost 80% of the manufacturing activities were moved into China. So China became indeed the manufacturing factory of the world, primarily to cost-cutting measures. This actually, you would find that this pandemic has given a major blow to this concept. Even otherwise, if you know that our traditional old age adage, don't keep all your eggs in the same basket. The reason for that was, in case the basket breaks, drops. Perhaps the world, in its design of the global supply chain, which was supposed to be competitive, ignored this adage, and perhaps kept all its eggs in the same basket, and that basket happened to be China. Because of that, the globalization and cost-cutting measures and all these pandemic, in fact, people even attribute the beginning of this pandemic is from China, which indeed is the source of supply to the rest of the world. And therefore, the first calamity to this pandemic became the suspension of the supplies coming from the manufacturing factories located in China to the rest of the world, and this in fact has impacted about 80% of the supplies to the globally connected supply chain. As a result of this pandemic, the supply systems have collapsed. The manufacturing operations, because of the lockdown in different countries, almost every country is under lockdown, where manufacturing operations stopped, and even supply systems, in fact, in the downstream side, except emergency supplies of food grains and the medicines. Other than groceries, food grains, and medicines, the supply chain of almost every other commodity has taken a big hit, which in fact even impacted the purchasing power of people, their money available at their hand, which indeed further has impacted the demand and becomes such a complex vicious circle. And that's why we need to, in this presentation, I wish to share with you some of the lessons that we have learned from this, and as the title says, adapting to the pandemic means that short-term measures that we need to create, immediate recovery from the disruption that has taken place, and the long-term strategies so that we are prepared in case such a calamity happens again in future. We are better prepared, and the kind of large-scale suspension of all economic activities and the supply systems across the globe would not be taking a hit as it has taken this time. So some of the lessons that we have learned actually would need to adapting to the new kind of the design of this supply chain. Now, since I mentioned supply chain is a flow of materials, information, money into, through, and out of the system, a kind of a analogy from those of you who might have an engineering background, which I have, is from the fluid mechanics that you have laminar flow, you have boundary layer, and you have turbulent flow. Today's supply chain actually is a highly turbulent flow, and therefore managing supply chain with high degree of turbulence that exists in the business environment, be due to supply uncertainties, disruptions, or stoppage of activities, people leaving, shortage of manpower, shortage of money available for buying, shortage of money available for paying to people. All this has caused terrible turbulence in the flow, and therefore we need to address this. Now, I now switch over to some of my points. As a result of this pandemic, the entire globe has been put into turbulence and chaos. So the entropy of the supply chain has increased tremendously because of this high degree of turbulence that we see in all the links. Earlier we used to say that a chain is governed by its weakest link. So throughout the chain covers, in the case of supply chain, from the vendor to the customer, that means end consumer, and therefore right from tier 2 supplier, or even tier 3 supplier, to the consumer, which is customer, the end consumer. Earlier we used to say that the weakest link will determine the strength of the chain, but in this context, almost every link has become weak link. The upstreams, the midstreams, and the downstreams, almost all the links have become fairly weak, and as a result, this large-scale turbulence and disturbance, we are seeing unprecedented, witnessing these times, unprecedented in the history of our times. The entire humanity faces challenges which nobody would have imagined. In fact, the supply chain designers would not have, in their enthusiasm in globalization and cost-cutting measures, putting all their eggs in the same basket, and that basket happened to be in China, actually has caused enormous, and therefore this supply chain today, because of this highly hyper-connected world, we are connected through a network of global supply chain. That was the result of globalization. And as you would see, one of the victims of this pandemic would be that our enthusiasm in too much of globalization might take a hit. Already, as you know, that we are started talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, and therefore vocal for local. These are the kinds of initiatives that we are seeing, because these are pains of globalization, which has hit the supply chain tremendously, which in turn has hit almost every other activity. And therefore, in this, there is a cascading effect due to connectedness, and the entire globe is now set into turbulence. And all these three flows, material, information, and money, are very drastically affected. Now, if you look at why it happened, because of competitive pressures of reducing costs and demanding customers, these are two things that have happened. As globalization became more and more, the customers became more and more demanding, and the simple reason was that if you don't offer value for money, somebody else will, and that somebody else can be in any part of the world. And therefore, our entire single point motto became in our all organizations to delight our customers better than our competitors do. And in that search for delighting demanding customers and the development that took place on the IT front, where almost the entire world became interconnected, there was enormous a high degree of globalization of supply chains. And this concept, it has taken a big hit, because as you know, globalization itself, even without Corona, introduced an element of uncertainty, because as you know, since you are outsourcing in your materials from different parts of the world, as I already mentioned, that the supply chain management efficiency is an indicator of the development index of a nation. And therefore, if you are getting supplies from a developed country, the supply chain may be of a high degree of effectiveness. You are taking some supplies from a less developed country because of the economy of or the cost consideration. There may be uncertainties, and as a result, globalization itself had added uncertainty, and we were calling it as a VUCA world. VUCA is a term which I'm sure many of you would, since I'm told you're all professionals associated with the SQ. VUCA was much more than the just-in-case environment that I was talking about in Indian context earlier. VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And therefore, our business environment, our demand and supply environment was becoming VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, because many times even the price of petroleum products is linked with the conversion values of the foreign exchange, the conversion of dollar into rupee. And therefore, as it is, even without pandemic, globalization and the VUCA world had added certain degree of turbulence in the supply chain, and for which the supply chain management experts had found a counter view. And that's why you must have heard the terms such as the agile supply chain, agility, responsive supply chain, and therefore responsive supply chain, agile supply chain were some of the responses to the VUCA world. But the amount of uncertainty that pandemic has caused is much more even beyond VUCA. It's in fact much more a disturbing business environment, much more than VUCA. And as a result of this globalization, supply chain became more and more vulnerable and more complex. In fact, we relied too much on outsourcing on some few suppliers, and therefore the risk in the context of supply chain actually got associated with the production and procurement processes, the transportation, shipment of goods, and fulfillment of the demand. And you'd see that almost all these links are under stress in today's situation. Although we are talking the context of supply chain management in VUCA world, but it's not the supply chain alone. Almost all aspect of human endeavor has been impacted by this COVID pandemic. It has impact on economic, social, political. You'll find that most of the politicians have been using the word supply chain so frequently. Psychological, in fact, working from home. If people are working from home and are not moved up their house for last 3-4 months, this might have some kind of a psychological impact on that. Policy level interventions, technological dimensions, and therefore all these are the various dimensions that this pandemic has. Although we'll be focusing on our theme of supply chain, and because of that extreme impact, supplies disturbed, many manufacturing plants have been closed, many ships are stranded at sea, many trucks actually got stopped at the place because they ran out of cash, and they couldn't move out because even conventional local informal transportation in the country has not got so much of electronic cash on the basis of these truck owners and drivers, and therefore trucks got stranded, ships got stranded at sea, airport, railway movement stalled, roads closed, no movement, little movement, and even cash flow got severely impacted. These are the background or the extreme context in which we need to address. Manufacturing plant output is severely affected due to work from home restrictions. Even where some limited permission has been given, you're working at 1/3 the capacity to maintain the social distances, and as a result, even the capacity restrictions have impacted the manufacturing plants to work at full. Supplies are affected. Movement of workers, supervisory staff is drastically restricted because of these limitations. Deliveries of goods and services are impacted. Inventory at the distributor level and retail level is not being replenished because of there are no supplies, and hence the shortages, particularly of some critical drugs, face masks, PPEs, food items, actually because of shortage, and the tendency of that inbuilt tendency in people to overstock during shortage just in case there are no supplies has actually severely impacted the inventories at the distributor level. Social distancing norms and hygiene practices are enforced, and price of essential commodities are showing surge even due to this. Now, these are the implications. Now, these disruptions in supply chain require immediately establishing the ability to understand the exposure, the extent to which supply chains have been exposed by this, to respond and then to secure the supplies. The response has to be, as you would see, short-term as well as long-term strategic policy interventions. The role of governance becomes extremely critical in this. Transparency, right up to the, in fact, right now, if you look at one of the major problems of Indian supply chain is that we at best end up with the tier 1 vendor. There is very little transparency beyond tier 1 vendor, so tier 2 vendor, even tier vendor, and even the local person, and it so happens that type 2 or type 3 tier 3 vendor you may not know whether he has the capacity to supply, and as a result, there is a need for enormous transparency right up to type tier 2 vendor, responsive structures, good governance, and all streamlined processes are a must. So that what we need to do, a total coordinated effort using people, process, and technology, and therefore complete transparency, complete interage and transparency. You are able to identify the potential source of disruption, and therefore increasing transparency right from the tier 2 or even earlier vendor right up to the consumer. Understanding the cause and impact of this disruption would help in countering the huge disruptions. If you have this transparency, we would be in a position to identify a potential critical link and take a remedial preventive focus, because as you know, a stitch in time saves 9. And that's why there is enormous need for leveraging information and communication technology and some of the advanced technologies that we'll be talking about under Industry 4.0, which have developed a significance in this situation as a long-term strategy. And as a result, organization must have will, skills, and the capabilities to respond effectively to such disturbances. As a result, two immediate supply chains which have been very most impacted by this are the medical supply chains and food supply chains. As you know, that almost everything else remained closed except these essential commodities and food supply chains and medical supply chains. And fortunately, due to the changing focus of the railways and even other modes of logistics and transportation, these essential commodities were flowing on while the passenger trains were not running, but very large goods train running across the country in a big way to ensure that we are all in this large country, we were able to get the supplies of food grains, essential commodities, and the medical supplies. And therefore, these were two types of supply chains which indeed had to be quickly re-engineered, which indeed became important. severe, as you know, in medical supply chain, the severe shortages of PPE, personal protection equipment, we were almost taken unawares, and the amount of stock of these PPEs we had in the country was severely very limited, and therefore which includes mask, gown, gloves, shoe covers, etc., which has now become extremely important. There is a huge requirement of these items, but production capacity that we had in the country was very severely limited. And fortunately, because of the focus here, you'll find that a quick response that some of the manufacturing plants gave, they started producing ventilators. For example, even Maruti, which is traditionally known for making cars, started talking about producing ventilators. Many companies which are in the textile mill started producing PPEs, face masks, gown, gloves, and shoe covers, etc. Production therefore had to be ramped manifold, which we could never imagine that the amount of requirement of these medical facilities. Production and procurement of these items through formal and informal supply chains became inevitable. Production and equipment like ventilators, respirators done through SMEs and LSCs. Production of pharma items like executables. Indeed, there was an order from even USA, from India, for producing executables, tablets, which indeed are manufactured mostly in Bengal. Alignment of both government and private sector became inevitable, and therefore PPP models for such a procurement had to be necessary. Similarly, on the food supply chain front, the supplies were severely impacted. The restricted movement during lockdown, migrant labor exodus contributed to this problem further. Prices of farm produce likely to increase because there is a shortage of people in the farm. Economic hardships on the farmer and the labor force, and the implications of this was that most of the food supply chains, especially in the emerging economy like India, are in the informal and unorganized sector. As you know, in fact, even about 90% of retail operations, which includes food supplies, also are in the kirana stores and unorganized and informal sector. There is very little or no insurance of this unorganized sector. They will face major, lower incomes and substantial unemployment. Government and private businesses must therefore support in uplifting the medical and food supply chains. The general strategies therefore has to be two-pronged. While we must implement robust public health, that means no compromise on the health and hygiene in terms of social distancing and all that goes, which are almost an operating necessity. We must minimize food security impacts, particularly the potentially enormous impact on incomes and employment generation through relief packages, direct monitoring benefits and social schemes, which to a certain extent the government is doing, and other voluntary agencies, NGOs are in fact doing in a big way. COVID-19 may stimulate therefore new business strategies in the future supply chain designs due to such an unprecedented disruptions, and therefore that's where you also see an opportunity in this calamity. Almost in every dark cloud there is a ray of hope, and therefore we have to look at this pandemic as a wake-up call, not to repeat the mistakes that we might have done in our over-enthusiasm and globalization and cost-cutting measures in spending so much money and in buying from outside India. And in India was no exception. As you know, with India and China, there is a major trade imbalance in favor of China and against India, because of the value for money, Indians perceived value for money, Chinese cheap products. Almost all of our major day-to-day things were from China, and this disruption has impacted that in a substantial way. And therefore, the KPIs, the key performance indicators of the supply chain matrix, conventional supply chain, the way we were measuring performance of supply chain using our score models or balance scorecard and many other multi-criterion tools available for measuring supply chain performance, they will undergo a change. In addition to the traditional metrics such as cost, quality, and delivery. Now, these are three important components that conventionally have been critical in measuring the performance of supply chain management efficiency and effectiveness, the cost at which you deliver, the quality at which you deliver, and the delivery schedule. Now, in addition to these conventional cost, quality, and delivery schedules, the new performance measures that supply chain management would have to include would be resilience. The resilience is one of the key re-engineering that we'd have to do. Resilience actually means that the supply chain is able to bear to a great degree such disturbances. We become robust, and therefore, as you know, sometimes some of the natural things we cannot avoid. And I often give an example, and many times we learn from an analogy. For example, as you know, that some of the natural calamities such as earthquake, we cannot predict. And sometimes we might have an unprecedented level of earthquake, so we can't predict it. But at least our response could be to develop a robust buildings, engineered buildings where despite earthquake, our structure will not crumble. And therefore resilience is an extremely important dimension that we need to address. And fortunately for India, some of the conventional methods of supply chain management will come back again. Because as you'd see, that we were, because of the just-in-case environment, we were already focusing on buffer stocks, on safety stocks, in just-in-case inventory models. And therefore, in order to develop that resilience, we might have to focus on some of the conventional models of supply chain of just-in-case kind that Indians were anyway doing. Responsiveness, because suddenly you find that the customer demand has undergone a change. Quickly response, reconfigurability. For example, one of the important dimensions that we'll have to do in a long-term design of supply chain, that we should be quickly able to reconfigure. In case my supply source A has seen a major disruption in supplies, I should be able to work out without much of delays, switch over to plan B, switch over to plan C, and if this capacity for the supply chain design to quickly reconfigure the new normal actually is one of the new dimensions that in the design in the long term. After we do the quick recovery as a short-term measure, in the long term, this quick recovery configurability, responsiveness, and the resilience to absorb the risk, adequate risk management and risk planning, because earlier in our cost cutting measures, we were not perhaps incorporating the risk. Now, for example, when we are going for the supplies from China at the lowest cost basis, the increased lead times and increased uncertainty of supplies and increased disruption possibilities and the increased vulnerability of supplies to risk of non-delivery. The moment we started factoring in those parameters, that so-called low cost may not become low cost. And therefore, this too much focus on visible cost and not factoring the invisible component of cost includes the uncertainty of supplies. Perhaps now we will be new normal. When we start evaluating options of cost, we'll incorporate, we'll factor in the uncertainties, the risk, vulnerability also is an important component, and therefore the cost has to be factoring in the risk associated with it and long lead times associated with it. And therefore, as a result, we need to upgrade our physical and IT infrastructure. As I mentioned, our supply chain has to become seamless right from tier 2 to the end consumer in a complete transparency. And our physical infrastructure, our IT infrastructure needs to be upgraded. As you know, the 4 components of supply chain, which actually all of them need to be refigured in, are facilities, or manufacturing physical facilities or technology, their location, their size, their numbers, the IT infrastructure, the information infrastructure, the inventory policies, and the structuring of the distribution network. These are the 4 components of supply chain, and the transportation and logistics, including the mode of transportation. All these parameters would have to be reconfigured and revisited and re-engineered. We have to develop predictive models for proactive scheduling. We can anticipate a demand and anticipate a problem, and a dynamic planning of supply demands, and maybe more collaborative models of supply management. Instead of competitive supply chain, the entire link partners right from tier T to the retail operations have to be seen as a seamless supply chain where we all have a common interest, and therefore instead of a competitive links, the various links competing with each other, the supplier competing with manufacturer, the manufacturer competing with the retailer, that a collaborative supply chain, and that's why for that we need to also introduce some very interesting newer models of even compensation. Instead of conventional methods of paying to your vendors, conventional method of paying to your retailers and others, maybe incentivize the all of them become the beneficiaries of increased supply chain efficiency and effectiveness, and therefore maybe a risk sharing and the gain sharing model of incentivizing that if we increase our effectiveness and increase our business, everyone across the chain would benefit. If we lose, all across the chain would share that risk, and therefore newer models and dynamic planning of supply and demands would have to be undertaken. And because of that, even the decision makers, policy planners, strategic policy makers would have to do enormous amount of what if kind of analysis. As you know, some of you in simulation modeling, what if kind of analysis tells you, it's a very powerful tool in telling you if to different types of scenarios building where you say, if that happens, I will do that. What should I do if that happens? It's my plan A. My plan is, if that happens, that's my plan A. If that happens, what do I do? Plan A. If that happens, what do I do? Plan B. And this kind of scenario building actually is a kind of a planning in advance proactively, so that such shocks don't come to you they don't do you unpleasant. You're already prepared for it. So the higher the degree of preparedness for it, the ease with which you switch over to scenario B or plan B is what would make you robust and a resilient supply chain, and therefore there'll be greater degree of impact of these supply chain models for strategic planning, and therefore some of the remarks that we see on this, there is a glaring global supply chain inefficiencies have come to fore. We were actually caught unawares, we're totally unprepared, and as a result, perhaps it also shows that we were overconfident in our supply chain design. We didn't anticipate, or maybe we thought we were invincible, everything would be wonderful and cozy. Too much dependence on China and other countries actually has come to a great question. And natural question, therefore, is why not we become self-reliant and produce ourselves? So, therefore, instead of the world becoming a global village, maybe a village has to now be a self-reliant unit of economy, of what Gandhi's concept of Gram Swaraj, where almost all the kind of necessities their supplies are confined into the local, and that's why perhaps the being vocal for local would mean that even the village economy would come to center stage. Instead of the world becoming a global village, the village economy would therefore become self-reliant, and that was the Gandhian concept of Gram Swaraj, and therefore it might become the long-term solution requires a focused approach. There has to be emphasis on suitable, scalable, and sustainable supply chains. The governments have a responsibility to provide an ecosystem, the right kind of business environment for a sustainable and responsible industry. That ease of doing business, which has been talked about, but this ease of doing business has to be felt by the people and have to be sustainable and responsible. Too frequent policy changes does not give you the sustainability dimension, does not give you a confidence that whatever policy decisions you take at the organization level would remain valid, because frequent policy changes at the policy planners level actually sometimes can cause an element of uncertainty, and therefore we have to, all of us, all the stakeholders have to address this. Post COVID-19, it may be a consumer driven demand pushing to alter their existing supply chain. Consumer driven demand would be the basic thing, and therefore the push type of system that we were producing would have to be revisited with optimal push-pull boundaries, as is the terminology that we use in supply chain. Open manufacturing facilities closer to the consumer demand to save. Actually, that's why I'm saying if you factor in the delivery cost, the uncertainties, opening manufacturing facilities closer to the consumer demand, which used to be conventional model of plant location that we were taught when we were studying engineering conventional methods, they have now become suddenly more relevant, and therefore ensure that supply chains become more and more resilient, and comeback of safety stock and classical inventory models that I was talked about would again become critical. Earlier, the JIT was telling us go in for one vendor only. Now, this one vendor only concept will not be functional, and because just in case environment, in case, and therefore maybe multiple sources of supplies would become important. Negotiating vendors would become important. New interpretation of the risk has to be given. The risk has to include not only the risk of supplies, lead times, and all that goes with it, and rise of near sourcing of shoring of finished products, not offshoring. Innovating supply chain contracts. For example, some of you might have already signed a long-term contract. Now, therefore, maybe that revisiting of those contracts, at least the short-term contracts, become necessary. And therefore, because sometimes you might have put there's a force majeure clause in most supply chains, because if there are vagaries of nature, then there are certain things that you are obliged to do. Maybe that such a vagary of nature does not come under force majeure, because it's beyond any conceivable imagined dimensions of contract, and therefore while you signed your contracts you might not have imagined this, and maybe there's a need for negotiating, revisiting the short-term contracts, particularly force majeure clause in this process. Now, another very important, this looks dichotomous. On one hand we say India is a labor-intensive economy, and yet on the same time we have been talking about Industry 4.0, 4.0, which is totally automation, and it's no surprising that India is one of those countries in the world which has focused so much on Industry 4.0, so much so that only before this pandemic, most of the conferences that I had been participating in were morely involved in Industry 4.0, which were dealing with the artificial reality, Internet of Things, big data analytics, blockchains, robotics, cloud computing, 3D printing. All these were in the 9 subsystems or technologies of Industry 4.0. Now we see a very powerful divine commonality, although which was looking as a paradox, that highly labor-intensive economies such as India and the Industry 4.0, which is almost automated systems, appear to be disconnect. But now you can see some relevance. For example, the blockchains, as you know, the blockchain concept gives a complete traceability of the money flow right from the tier 2 vendor to the end consumer, and therefore in ensuring the traceability and total transparency and no possibility of bungling or fuzzing the money flow, the blockchains as one of the very powerful concepts in Industry 4.0 would become a very powerful concept, because a blockchain, as some of you might know, ensures that there is no bungling can be done with money, right, and the complete traceability. And analytics, for example, as I mentioned, the supply chain analytics, where you're able to look at different demand scenarios, what kind of experimentation, business analytics, data analytics will become important. Internet of Things, where everything becomes interconnected, and a totally, in order to have designed a complete supply chain, becomes totally interconnected Internet of Things. Artificial intelligence for driving decision making, and robotics for material handling. Sometimes due to the very rigid hygiene principles in where human beings are involved, as you notice now, the importance of robotics and automation, because of the safe distance of 2 meters or 6 gaj, and other wearing mask and hygiene. Sometimes, at least for material handling and some of the routine operations, it may be more economical to switch over to robotics instead of involving the people, because when involving people, only 1/3 people can join in, because you have to maintain distances, your space utility will come down, and maybe it's time where some of the routine operations or material handling and other situations where hygiene is critical, and therefore human beings would not be able to be productive if they have to maintain such a distance. Robotics would again come, and that's why I'm saying this is a new bigger for Industry 4.0 automation will come. Digitalization would move towards, in fact, digitalization is indeed is going a big way. Supplier selection, visibility across the supply chain, customer relationship management, supplier relationship management, and joint cash flow. Actually, today the need of the hour is have joint cash flow management and collaborative forecasting. Logistics, routing, dispatching, maintenance, focus on localization and globalization. Globalization is while you are locally producing, but let it be globally competitive, so that you don't have to buy even routine things like even our Diwali, lights and other things in China. We're as competitive as China, although producing are local, but they're globally competitive. That's why I call globalization, and to contain risk and supply disruptions. And therefore, this is where many companies are shifting manufacturing base from China. It's a great opportunity for India. About 33% of manufacturing base from China is likely to be shifted to Asian countries, and India can look at this as a huge opportunity where Japan and Korea could be our close competitors. Many joint ventures and pipelines, and therefore, as a result, the government's trust on Atmanirbhar or self-reliant supply chain is a very topical and timely concept. But this opportunity has to be suitable, scalable, and sustainable, and has to be cost-effective globally. So while have local manufacturing, but make it globally competitive, and that's why focus on productivity, cost reduction, quality, customer orientation, all become extremely important. And therefore, India will become a curious mix of Industry 4.0, they localized, homemade supply chain solutions. Manual labors may be replaced by robots for critical operations to conform to the social distancing norms and hygiene, transparency from end to end, and potential risk. Now, the imperatives, and now towards the close-up of my presentation, some of the imperatives of the new supply chain of the new normal. We have to build in visualization and predictive capabilities. I will be able to foresee problems, use of virtual and augmented reality, hyper-connected customer with work-from-home employee. Almost every Internet of Things would also mean Internet of People. And therefore highly interconnected, so that even from work from home, you are as if you are working from your office. Zoom, Google Meet, WebEx platforms for employee training and retraining and counseling will become important. Already it's happening. Industry 4.0 protocols for automation, vibrant and sustainable linkages between regional and local aspirations, local for vocal to global, concern for employees and their health and well-being, and focus on social responsibilities as a measure of performance rather than conventional profit and cost. And with the new normal, the shift towards localization, digital gets a real push, cash is the king for business, move towards variable cost models and supply chain resilience, and build that agility in the system. Now, some of the, for example, Amul has done that very quickly adopted this example. You see, for example, they didn't produce ice creams because that's a very highly requires controlled conditions, and instead they started increasing the purchase of other things, and they very quickly they moved in their supply chain. Similarly, Wildcraft is a Bengaluru-based company which are making in outdoor clothing, footwear. They started manufacturing, producing innovative face masks, and therefore added 65 manufacturing plants to produce world-class masks at the same time, providing employment. Therefore, we need to revisit. Finally, concluding the march, traditional concept of supply chain will require re-engineering. COVID-19 has provided us an opportunity to look at the localized solutions in a different way. Local can be cheaper if risk of supply chain disruption is factored in. So when we evaluate our tenders, the moment we start putting the risk of supply chain disruption, the Chinese products which look cheaper will not be cheaper anymore. However, local has to be globally competitive to sustain. As I mentioned, it has also prompted us to revisit relationship between the corporate, government, and society. The connotations associated with the risk are undergoing a transformational change. Now, L1 has to include risk-adjusted costs. Scenario building will call for standby options as L2, L3. Work from home, social distancing, social security, virtual meetings are going to become norms. That's what we are doing today. A new set of metrics would evolve to judge efficacy of our supply chain. A new domain is going to emerge where design of supply chain will be dictated by public healthcare systems. This is what I had to say. Thank you for giving me a patient hearing. It had been one way so far. It's for you to now raise your questions. I can only tell you the best in me comes out in a questioning mode. Over to you. And in there.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. It was very enlightening, and frankly speaking, I've got a host of questions to ask you. We'll go by as the sequence of questions that arrived in the chat box and also in the Q&A section that we have. And as I see, there are more questions that are coming in. So the first question that we received was from the where community asked is as the employees are being been laid off due to pandemic situation, and the Indo-China relationship is also going worse day by day. So what is your opinion on this? Like in future, will this affect all the sector, and how would it affect the supply chain management in the current situation?
The last 45 minutes are only addressing good parts.
Exactly.
If I look at my entire focus of presentation was only that, because now supplies from China in fact are affected and will be affected more in future given our geopolitical relationship. Maybe we might have to switch over from China to some other country, but mostly local. Therefore, the new supply chain and the purchasing power of people is impacting demand. People don't have money. People are losing jobs. And once you don't have jobs, and when you beyond 3 months, when you are on the dole of somebody, government supplying you ration, therefore it's going to be a totally different world, and that's what I was trying to address. Our supply chain therefore has to be totally different, and therefore new local solutions, outsource has to be within some local community. Maybe, as I mentioned, Gandhi's concept of Grand Swaraj. Always people who lost their job, they went to their villages. They may not come to the metropolitan. They have seen what miserable life they have seen during this pandemic, and they've gone through hell in going to their villages. And as a result, maybe they would find new opportunities of generating employment with the help of state government right there. And there was a large number of local new startups and industries in the vicinity of local, and that's why, as I said, the village and around that village or a nucleus company around that. Perhaps that's where the so supply chain will become more and more local rather than global because of this.
Right. Excellent response. Thanks so much. And in fact, the rural economy also will start looking differently from going forward.
And it's a good thing. That's why I say positive change in it. Many of these people coming from different parts of this country to Bombay and Delhi and so on, and were living in substandard conditions in slums, might have a better quality of life when they go back home and rediscover themselves a potential. Absolutely. It could be a great opportunity of rural development.
Very true, sir. Another question, which is more of a clarification in terms of, I think you have given enough examples. Just in case if you would like to, anything is on, what do you mean by responsive structure? Though you talked a lot about that in your, I will also follow up with another question which was there in terms of
conventional supply chains were actually divided into two types: functional supply chain and responsive supply chain. Functional supply chains were like when you have a stable product such as a car. For example, the supply chain of, let's say, Maruti Udyog Limited would be a functional chain because the product is not a fashionable product, and there's a long life cycle. The product shelf life is longer. Then there are some, like for example, if the conventional, for example, fashion products where the product life cycle is very short, maybe 3 months, 6 months. The kind of supply chains that were designed for such short cycle products were called responsive supply chain, where we quickly know what the new fashion is. As you know, Zara Corporations indeed has developed a tremendous fame in developing cost-effective supply chain in a responsive framework, where they can foresee responsive supply chain is a term used for products life cycles which are short in, let's say, fashion products. But it also means, and the other term similar to that is agile supply chain. There is a difference between responsive and agility. Agility is that suppose some particular system breakdown has taken place, in supply. One of your major sources of supply got disrupted. Suppose there was a fire in your major supplier's plant. How quickly you reconfigure and respond to the agility is the quick response. And therefore responsiveness, agility are somewhat interlinked, but resilient is something that actually now more robust and risk covered. Because responsive supply chain was conventionally used for short cycle fashionable products. Functional supply chain was used for more long duration products such as engineering products.
In fact, there was a question on agile supply chain, so that addresses that particular question itself. There was one interesting thought process where one asked, wouldn't increased transparency eliminate importance of middlemen? So that's something that I think this is.
It would and it should.
It should, actually, exactly.
It should. And it's a very good thing. Perhaps if you look at what is making India less and competitive, the middlemen.
Yes. Exactly, and that's where the many costs will come in.
If you look at the total cost of, in fact, one of my PhD scholars is working on whole supply chain, and so a farm to fork connect, which is a supply chain. You look at the cost at which a farmer sells his tomatoes and potatoes, and the cost at which I as a consumer buy them. Bulk of it is cornered by the middleman, and therefore, if such a transparency exposes a middleman or eliminates a middleman, this is what would make Indian supply chain globally competitive, because the major problem is coming at the middleman cornering a major share, and therefore that's a plus point. That indeed is the reason for it, and there's the reason blockchains would ensure that the middleman again cannot even fudge any accounts, and therefore transparency and the information and communication technologies and the latest automation and digitalization definitely would uncover these practices. Definitely.
There is thank you so much, sir. There is another very interesting question in terms of of course this is a burning thought process. In such pandemic situation, every manufacturing firm is focusing on operational cost as their key factor. So what key factors are followed by organizations to optimize themselves in such competitive market?
Actually, operational cost is the most fundamental cost. Actually, this is a very good point. Unfortunately, in our management schools, we have underplayed the operations management, because the real value addition takes place at the operations level. Everyone else supports it. So somewhere in a classical business school, we have focused too much on strategies and policies. A strategy and policy which does not deliver value for money is not implementable. So it's a good thing that operationalization has got the focus, because as I mentioned, conventional industrial engineering, which has been ignored in recent times, is what makes you globally competitive, because conventional industrial engineering focuses on operations management, where you knock out wastages, improve productivity, eliminate wastages, enhance quality, and reduce response time. All these methods are going to play a major role in improving operational efficiency, which in turn would reduce the cost, which in turn would reduce would make you more competitive and delight your customers. Value for money is the only way you can sustain a customer's interest in you, and operational efficiency and operational effectiveness, which indeed has been somewhat ignored in favor of some fashionable management jargons. I'm happy that if people rediscover that our old age operations management efficiency is going to be the key critical component to make us competitive. It's a good thing.
There are actually a couple of more questions on IoTs and artificial intelligence. So let me just pick up one of these. How can an artificial intelligence and machine learning system tools help to stabilize the supply chain disruption due to COVID, and which supply chain sector requires more support to bring stability? I think apart from the idea that we talked about, I think important is that which supply chain should sort of pick off, so that the entire industrialization that was happening, the industrial movement that was happening, which has come to a grinding halt due to pandemic. What are the various sectors do you think would be important here?
You have to jump. You see, some sectors which are important for example, food and medicine. the essential sectors. The government had already, and therefore, despite this lockdown, the goods train were running round the clock. Now, some other sectors which indeed are critical, where we have the major gaps, for example, in terms of you'll find that even transportation and logistics, our manufacturing operations in automobile sector has almost come to a halt. We need to revisit them because logistics and transportation is an important component of supply chain management, and therefore some of the techniques of that industry 4.2 that you are talking about have to be cautiously used. And first I'll talk about artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence primarily is mimicking the human intelligence. That's why it's artificial. It's not, can never be a replacement of real intelligence. What it does, that it facilitates your decision making, and some of the things which can be routinized using artificial intelligence, you're able to quickly take a decision. And therefore, for our decision support system, some of the routine methods, we must make use of artificial intelligence at the operations level. It helps us our decision support system. It helps us in making inferences based on data. So what an artificial intelligence does, it actually uses data and the inference engine and the model to quickly come to conclusion. For example, your Google map, you see, which has become now so important in navigation, it actually uses artificial intelligence in telling you the shortest path to reach your destination. And therefore, these tools of artificial intelligence, such as using Google Maps, have now become such a routine thing that now most of those people, even the taxi drivers or the Uber, Ola driver, unless they put that map on, they may not take you to the destination. They were so much used to it. So these are artificial engine driven decision support systems, and therefore, in my opinion, in improving the effectiveness of decision making, artificial intelligence as a decision support system will play a big role. Robotics will play a role wherever human involvement is either injurious to their health, or because of the social distancing norms, you cannot match the productivity, because at 1/3 the capacity you can't run a plant productively, or where it's hazardous in an operations where you would not like to have a hazardous human intervention. So in those places, selectively you will go for robotics. Blockchain can be very effective to see the seamless visibility of the money flow, and therefore we have to use these technologies of Industry 4.0 very cautiously. And again, in our enthusiasm and over enthusiasm, don't mix up in using it where it should not be. It has to be very cautiously chosen. And therefore, as a result, almost those companies, for example, at the routine unorganized sector, conventional simple automation of your data logging, your automation, your computerization of their records itself is good enough. But at the automobile OEM manufacturer, for example, in Maruti or Hero, Honda, or maybe General Motors, which have fairly high degree of automation already, they can perhaps go for the more advanced Industry 4.0 technologies. So definitely it will be a combination.
You are absolutely right. What I want to also follow up in terms of, there was another question from one of the attendees asking in terms of how's India's adaptation to Industry 4.0. What is your sense it takes in this current pandemic and all this? Any kind of view? I think it's a very I'm putting you in a spot to give an answer on this, but any thoughts that you have?
Really, this question has been asked very pertinently to me. Because very recently, I submitted my report to the Department of Heavy Industry, Udyog Bhavan. See, when as I mentioned, the whole country was talking about Industry 4.0 everywhere. So, Department of Heavy Industry appointed a 3-member task force under my chairmanship to evolve a national policy framework, or recommend a national policy framework for adopting Industry 4.0 in Indian context. Myself, a professor from Indian Institute of Science, Professor Chakravarti from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and Mr. Anup Wadhwa, who is a director of AI, the automobile. Therefore, we have given our report to them and presented before the secretary. What we really require, that there has been an overhype about Industry 4.2 in recent times.
Right.
Now, overhype, as you know, is not good for anything. Overhype actually makes us more emotional rather than rational. So what I'm recommending is that we have to take up these technologies in a selective manner wherever they are in, and therefore not whole hog about the entire all the 9 technologies together. We first find out where some of them are low-hanging fruits where we can go immediately. Like I said, artificial intelligence, automation, big data analytics, simulation. We can go in a big way because these are low-hanging fruits where does not require huge investment. And some of the other technologies will take a little. So we have given our report, and this was before a pandemic, and immediately after there was a pandemic. Let's see to what extent but then we have given a 20-year plan, right up to, we hope that really by 2040, India would be really prepared to absorb in totality the Industry 4.2, but in a 5-year point, we are saying by 2025 we must focus on this, by 2030 we must focus on this, and therefore a carefully piloted, cautious approach is required in adopting this. Right now we were in a frenzy, so almost every conference that I was attending was Industry 4.0. So that degree of hype is not required because we have our limitation. These are expensive technologies, and therefore cautious approach is required.
Very true. So in fact, even low-cost automation one can also explore. So that's another opportunity you can look at.
Low-cost automation is a low-hanging fruit. As I mentioned, by name itself, it's a low-hanging fruit.
That's
and
right.
SMEs can do it in a big way. SMEs can adopt the low-cost automation in a big way. It's a low-hanging fruit that I was talking about.
Right, right. So I've got deluge of questions, but I'll quickly pick up one or two just to close the session. I have a very interesting question from Vaishali here, and he talks about Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative, although will help a lot to boost Indian manufacturing sector. However, the idea has been seen as as complete boycott to products specially manufactured in China. Living in a business silos is not an option. How can government and Indian industry create a balance among the cross-border trade and indigenous products, keeping product cost competitive? So I think it's a good point in terms of we would continue to still import.
It's a very, very, very good point. In fact, see what we have to see when we design long-term strategies and policies, they cannot be on emotion. They have to be rational. Sometimes emotion itself is short-lived, and on the basis, while it's good to have self-reliance is a great thing. And in fact, I was mentioning that we perhaps missed the bus at. I was maybe in my conversation, I was telling you or someone else that I had advised to the European Commission in 1991 to invest more in India, not in China, but they ignored my advice and went in for China, and they are now perhaps realizing the mistake, because a democratic institution always has the strength, and as a result, India definitely has major opportunities in this pandemic, but we have to also create a right environment, the ease of doing business. Now, regarding the boycott of Chinese goods, we have to look at it in 2 ways. I am not in favor of burning what you already have. That's a waste of resources. You already paid money, it belongs to you, and it in no way does, by burning it, you're only causing loss to the national resources and, of course, pollution. So this concept of burning Chinese products is, to my mind, is hyper emotion issues, but trying to replace Chinese products more and more with India, because I cannot imagine why should you buy Ganesh Murthy from China, why should you buy Lakshmi Murthy from China, a country which does not believe in Hindu mythology, and therefore we were perhaps overdoing it, and the reason for that was the Chinese were dumping things at a low cost. So while we focus on Atmanirbhar Bharat for sure, and that's why I mentioned that make local, but that's why I use the word globalization, local but globally competitive. So that you not only your own people would buy, but you'll be able to export it to the other countries. And in the process of making it globally competitive, if you need to outsource components, products, materials from different countries, do it, because this does not mean totally shutting up the economy. Only saying a cautious approach in developing a network, and that's what the reconfigurability of your supply chain network, from where to go in, factoring in the uncertainties, and therefore obviously isolation is not going to be an issue, and I don't think the localization intended to do that. So while we buy more and more our own products, but burning Chinese products is not an answer. Okay, I hope I've given.
No, absolutely, sir. I think it was spot on. I have a couple of little more traditional set of questions in terms of, do you think the old age management principles are best and to be followed because of modern principles like just-in-time management, resulting all eggs in one basket situation, and over enthusiastically outsourcing, in my opinion, proven tested method at the best?
I agree. In fact, I don't know. Actually, we have, and some of our business schools have to also learn the lesson. Whenever I teach materials management, I always say that just in time. You see what happened. Our problem in this country has been that not only the products, even the management philosophies we have been borrowing from outside. Earlier, we were borrowing from Western world, the Taylor and all its co-workers and Hindi fuels principles. Well, some of them might make sense. Then we started borrowing from Japanese manufacturing, Japanese management, just in time, zero inventory. I have often been saying management is always situation specific. What succeeded in Japan and just in time, if you were to follow just in time in Indian context, you will be sunk. Because in just in time, the key word is time. And unfortunately, most of us have high degree of tolerance on ambiguity on time. If we are plus minus half an hour here and there, we think we are on time. So how can a highly precision driven technique such as just in time can work in a highly ambiguous society where, for example, in Japan, the lateness of a train is measured in, if a train is 2 seconds late, it's called late.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Even in a best managed metro, the definition of lateness of a metro is 59 seconds. So therefore, transplanting a management technique from some other context, to my mind, has been a misfit. Unfortunately, because of our mindset that everything foreign is great, we ignored our own values and our own management philosophy. So I'm all for robust common sense, robust adages that a stitch in time saves 9 is a very preventive focus. A stitch in time saves 9. In your preventive cost of quality, it so turns out that the cost of failure is 10 times more than the cost of preventing a failure in cost of quality, and therefore a stitch in time saves 9 almost gives you the numerical number to cost of prevention and cost of failure. So those, not to put all the eggs in the same basket, they are very time tested, very robust common sense, and to my mind, I always have been saying that common sense sometimes is not that common as the name implies. You should have been using more.
Well said, sir. Sir, I'll take last question, though I have got more questions, but I'll just take one last question specifically since we have overshooted our time and this session is anyway till 12:15. Last question in terms of what do you think about opportunity for professionals in supply chain management, or in terms of the job related future prospect for career prospect?
As I mentioned earlier, supply chain management effectiveness and efficiency is an index of the development index of the nation. There's 70% correlation. So therefore, supply chain management can actually be a real development agenda for nation building. Because when you talk of supply chain, you require infrastructure, physical infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, logistics, information infrastructure, ports, airports, ports. Then before it's an enormous scope, because it almost covers almost everything that you require in developing a country. 70% correlation. So it's a tremendous scope for professional development, but professional development means professional development. Learn the right kind of technologies, right way of techniques, and use them in the right context. Instead of blindly transplanting from some other context to some other context, because we have to be careful in designing our own supply chain logically, our own vendor development methods, our own performance metrics, and so to that extent, there's a great degree of professionalization opportunity, because right now, the Indian supply chain management is not highly professional, which is reflected by a simple fact that while the cost of supply chain management in a developed world is 6% of its turnover. The supply chain and logistics cost in India is 14% of its turnover.
Oh.
You're almost paying double the cost. This already, if you can make it efficient and effective due to professionalization, you straight will knock out 6 to 7% of the cost to the consumer, and because of the competition, the margins are dwindling. You almost become competitive globally the moment you knock out, and there's great opportunity for supply chain management. And as it is, materials constitute almost biggest single element of cost of doing business. Materials management, inventory management, which again has been ignored in this country. About 80% of cost of manufacturing automobile is the material cost alone. So therefore, there is a huge room for manufacturing, for professionalization in materials management and supply chain. Unfortunately, we had ignored this. It's extremely important, and we must not ignore it anymore if we want to be local but globally competitive.
I think that's very well said in terms of specifically 40%. It's a huge opportunity we see, and I think this is where more we build professional people who can help reduce the cost and other areas. Sir, this conversation can go on. I think I will have to invite you once again with some other topic, and time does not, the small time that we have set aside does not justice the conversation with you, but I thoroughly enjoyed. I'm assuming people who attended, there are still people who are still holding on and have still, I can see questions coming in. Sir, we'll thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. I thank the participants for their patience in listening to me for that long, and thank you all the best. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Professor Premvarad. The next last month, we'll have our seminar, again webinar, which will be topic on emotional balance in turbulence time. We talked about supply chain. Let's also understand the human element in terms of how do we balance that. So we have a very interesting speaker there, and she'll talk about how to keep your emotional balance in turbulence time. So please, on 26th of July, please do log in and spread the message. We will be sending across all the information about this to your email address. So with that, thank you so much, sir. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. All the best.
Bye. Bye. Bye.